I would recommend, I don't know if people have read this book, but the book he's talking about, called 9 Days Wonder. I think probably there's a little bit more to it than even they're letting out there. I don't think it's quite as simple as the story appears to be. So, for instance, in this book, he starts off by saying, why is everybody lying about me? Why do they think I didn't dance all the way from London to Norwich? And he talks quite a lot of rubbish, and it's a very easily mockable book, which in fact is mocked, I think, in the Parnassus plays. But it's very, very fascinating, and I would recommend, it's a short book, I'd recommend you read it, if for no other purpose, but to see how silly, parsimonious and pompous Kemp could be. And interesting enough, we had a little, I read a poem, if you remember, earlier this evening, coming from Romeo and Juliet. And what I didn't say then is, in the first folio, it says just in front of it, enter Kemp. The traditional view of that is that that Kemp played that part or something like that, and they accidentally dropped it into the first folio. I would hazard a guess that there's a bit of mocking of Kemp is actually going on there, because we go straight into that speech about the silver sound. What is a silver sound all about? What does that mean? Oh, it's about getting money for music. So I think there's mocking of the players there and their mercenary ways through Kemp, but that's for another time. We are now going to have 20 minutes of questions and answers, and very much hope that all will be encouraged to participate by posting your questions to the panel, which you can do by clicking on the Q&A thingamy at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can ask us about anything and be as rude or as forthright or as polite or whatever you wish. So fire away. If by some misfortune we run out of time, I think actually we're ahead of time, so we probably won't, but if that should happen before your question gets addressed, then our discourses will be continued on the members forum at the De Vere Society website at deveresociety.co.uk. Now, I think Rosemary is putting the questions to us. So do we have a question, Rosemary?
Hello, Alexander, and hello, everyone. Greetings from Dublin. So to get the ball rolling, I'm going to put a question to Howard. Howard, Shakespeare seems to have combined elements of commedia dell'arte and commedia erudita in his plays. And why do you think that is? And who were the different audiences that he was appealing to in the one performance?
Well, I'm kind of quite new to the whole Shakespeare I think why he drew those, I'm for a while in working with commedia, I saw a connection between Shakespeare and commedia. Having now started to look into it more, I'm very much of the opinion that De Vere was Shakespeare, and that he went and in his time in Italy, he would have been in the courts and in the streets. He would have been seeing these different plays, bringing that style back into his own writing. And I think that the two are kind of at different levels. They are, I think, commedia dell'arte, which was much, not actually just of the streets, but combined street and the erudita. But there were two different audiences. And if you look at the plays of Shakespeare, you look at the Globe, you know, you've got the more well-off sitting at the back, and you've got the groundlings at the front, and the plays play out to all of those audiences. They seem to be able to picture all of these different audiences, and it's what makes them so inclusive. And I think it's what makes commedia inclusive, is it's pitched at, I mean, commedia particularly is pitched at as many audiences as you can get, because you're passing the hat round very often. So you're trying to be able to play to anywhere, and you will adapt your play to what your audience is, and it's set up to do that. So I suspect that De Vere took that knowledge and took it into the writing of these plays. I think that answers it. Kevin, I think, had his hand up to answer. Speaking of that, I think.
Hello, good evening. Fantastic. talk there, Howard. Absolutely brilliant. I wish we could hear a lot more from you. I did give an outline in Great Oxford about the commedia dell'arte and the influence on Shakespeare. If we're going to accept Edward de Vere as the author, then almost certainly he witnessed the commedia in Italy. But I don't think it was just in public, in ordinary theatres, sort of ordinary piazzas and streets. I think it was actually in houses belonging to the rich, and the comedians would come in and they would perform there for the people in the rich houses as well as out on the streets. It reminds me of a Peruvian band I once paid a lot of money to go and see in Blandford Forum, and then earlier in the afternoon they were actually playing on the streets as well, exactly the same music that I saw in the theatre a bit later on. So I think these commedia people were able to play in both. And what they had was this huge repertoire of lazzis, as you said, these small little scenes, the scenarios, which is the sort of bigger outlines, and they could improvise and adapt them to whichever audience they had. And I'm sure that whoever watched it, who came to write Shakespeare, was absolutely enamored of all these, would have seen and talked to them as much as possible. So when it comes to actually writing them up, though, these things are being sort of held for posterity. So I imagine that what we're going from is, like, as you said, the jazz musicians at the beginning who are then performing it as a sort of set piece at the end. So I don't see that there's any sort of huge, great distinction between the commedia dell'arte and the commedia erudita, except for the fact it's probably written down at the end.
So the distinction, as we normally understand it, is that erudita, was meant to be read in a bit more intellectual, a bit more referencing the classics or something like that. Is that?
I think it definitely did, but I think that's according to who the audience is at the beginning. If you think about the players who come to Elsinore and perform in front of Claudius and in front of Hamlet, they've got a wide repertoire of things that they can do. So they can perform at a lower level as well as at a higher level. But I think what Shakespeare, what Edward de Vere has done, is he's taken these scenarii, these lazzi, and he's put them into plays which is then written down. So what he's done is he's used the origins of the commedia dell'arte and then he's put it down into the erudita form.
Yeah.
Jan Schaefer and the late Ron Hess, they had a very, very interesting paper in Oakland a few years ago about that. So I think that must be somewhere.
Yes, just one thing to say about Vere, which is often forgotten, well, certainly by his detractors, is that he went to Italy 1575 to 76. He didn't go simply to go on holiday, to lounge around, to have fun. He went there on a mission, really, to discover what he could discover about educators, about scholars. And it seems very likely that he looked very, very carefully at the theatre, because that was something he was very interested in, with a specific view to coming back and altering the course of British theatre. And of course, it was just after he returned that the two first theatres were erected, the Curtain and the one known as the Theatre. Now, I know Kevin believes that the Lord, the unnamed Lord that appears in a manuscript, who is said to have built one of those theatres, Kevin thinks it's Leicester. I think it's probably Oxford, but it's tantalising. We don't really know which one it was. There's a very interesting poem, which is deep and difficult and only 4 lines long, dedicated to Roscius, to Edward Allen, the actor, by Weaver. And if you read it very carefully, and if you connect it to what has been written in the poem immediately before it, which is addressed to William Shakespeare, you can tell that what he's really saying is that this stuff all came back from Italy, and it came back from the same person who was William Shakespeare. But that's for another time, analysing those two poems, but they are absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I absolutely agree there, Alexander. But one thing I would like to point out is that a couple of Shakespeare's tragedies are really comedies that have gone wrong. So Romeo and Juliet would be a play ordinarily where the lead characters don't die, where they manage to escape. And if you look at a lot of those figures, exactly as Howard said, they are the stock figures of the commedia dell'arte. And really, it's the same with Othello. So it's a very similar situation where unfortunately it all goes wrong, that Shakespeare, the creative mind, has imposed on it a tragic tale as opposed to this original one. I love what Howard said about having the sort of two houses on either side and being so different. I think that's absolutely terrific. And those improvisations that you were able to do there, Howard, fantastic. So I'd love to hear a lot more about that. Anyway, thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Howard.
Can I just speak into that a little bit? What Alexander was saying, that for me, working in Commedia, one of the things you find about it is it has such knowledge of theatre, has knowledge of narrative, knowledge of character, knowledge of set, knowledge of the theatre stage space itself. So that makes a lot of sense to me, that someone's gone and studied this form and brought this knowledge of not just playwriting but theatre back to the Elizabethan court and created these amazing works that have stood the test of time.
Am I on here too, Alexander?
You are indeed, yep.
Yes, I wanted to play off something that Kevin was mentioning about Othello. One of the most extraordinary to me talks that I ever listened to was by Richard Wayland and Ren Drea quite a long time ago, indicating that Othello, they had found that the underpinnings of the characters were from the Commedia. The guy who steals the father's daughter, and the angry father, and the Iago character as well, speaking to the audience, if you will. It's more detailed than I have the memory of, but the whole extraordinary idea that Oxford would have brought the underpinnings of what we think of as exaggerated character into a tragedy like Othello, and used it as the opening of his structure is extraordinary. That's all I can tell you about that.
Yes. Rosemary, are more questions coming in? Because I think the best thing is if we just have a gentle, thoughtful stop like we did just then, and you've got another question, just barge straight in with it.
Perfect. Yes, the questions are coming in thick and fast. So I'm going to put two of them to you, Alexander. One is from Shirley Egan Donovan. She would like to know, have you any projects at the moment? And if you could perhaps speak a little bit about that. And also from Shelley Maycock as to whether Great Oxford, which of course is the book of essays published by the De Vere Society, whether that is going to be reprinted.
Yes, I can answer both those questions. Firstly, the projects I'm involved with at the moment, quite apart from the work we're doing with the De Vere Society. I know this has been going on for a very long time and people know about it and they're getting itchy and irritated that it's taken quite so long. But it just means it's going to be better and better when it comes out. There's a lot of tinkering and correcting. I'm talking about the 2-volume Shakespeare allusion book, which I have co-edited, written with Roger Strittmatter. And that I think will, well, I don't want to be conceited, but I really do think it'll be a turning point in the whole Oxfordian argument. What it does is to take the allusions to William Shakespeare, contemporary allusions, running from 1593 when that name first appears in print, through to the, really very, very solidly indeed to 1642, and then slightly more chosen after that, but really everyone you've got. And why I think this is such a spectacularly interesting book is because as I was working on it and as Roger was working on it, we came to realize that every single contemporary commentator writing about William Shakespeare knew perfectly well that it was a pseudonym and that it was a pseudonym being used by Edward de Vere. Now, we've had quite a lot of discussion of some of these individual allusions before, but to put the whole lot together all in one place and to see that every single person knew it, but they were all sort of playing slight games of nod, nod, wink, wink. So that's, I really, really hope will be in publication form within, I don't know, 5-6 months. We're still just doing the last corrections. I have another project which I'm working on at the moment, which is a drama. It's a script, a biopic of Edward de Vere. I think most people will have looked him up on Wikipedia when it gets going, so they'll probably know that he's a candidate for William Shakespeare. But in fact, if you don't do that, you'll get as far, I think, as episode 6 or I think maybe episode 7, when you realize he is William Shakespeare. And I think this is a really, really fascinating project, and I'm very grateful to certain people who've put a lot of encouragement behind me to get on with this and do it. Why it's so fascinating? Well, we all know that Edward de Vere did have an incredibly interesting life. I mean, everything in it, from swashbuckling to trouble with women to bankruptcy, to this absolutely extraordinary talent which people praised him for. It starts in 1572, the great debacle over the execution of his friend and his mentor, the Duke of Norfolk. And you'll probably remember that he goes and petitions the Queen and petitions Leicester and Burleigh, his father-in-law, to try and stop this execution from happening. And he even devises a rescue plan to get him out of the Tower. And why that's a very important time for Edward de Vere. He's 22 years old. He's literally only just got married. But it's a very important time for him indeed, because when Norfolk does get executed, the Queen delays it and delays it, but she does chop his head off eventually. And he feels this terrible sense of betrayal, not least betrayal of his father-in-law of Burleigh, who he feels connived actually in the downfall of Norfolk. Norfolk was so important to him, although he was a little bit older. He was actually the executor of his will, and so was Leicester. Leicester entirely benefited from that will, and one feels that a lot of Vere's financial problems were kicked off by the way that his estates were pretty well fleeced by Leicester. And I don't have proof of this, but I suspect that Norfolk very much stuck up for Vere, and that's why he felt so strongly about it. So that's the starting point. And then it goes through 9 episodes, and we'll finish in a rather a strange and philosophical way in episode 9, where we're left really with the Queen close to her death, Edward de Vere close to his death, and the figure of John Dee, the old man, who brings so much of the philosophy that we see in Shakespeare. And so those 3 will end it, and the whole thing is structured on 3 times 3, something I was talking about a little bit when I was looking at that bird's setting of My Mind to Me a Kingdom Is. And 3 times 3 is really the key, I think, to opening up a lot of mysteries in the Elizabethan age. There's that wonderful, well, people think it's just a purely comic moment that happens in Love's Labour's Lost, when Costard is told, "Thrice 3 is 9, and he says, "Not so, sir, we know what we know." Well, there is a great secret that is wrapped up in 3 times 3, and it was through that secret, through the 3 times 3, that I located the burial place, final burial place of Edward de Vere, which is smack underneath the Shakespeare Monument in Westminster Abbey. So that's going to be the sort of denouement of this extraordinary program, and it's something I'm very much doing at the moment. So I know that a lot of people very kindly and very nicely follow the videos that I've been putting online, and they've probably been wondering why there haven't been many videos going down lately. Well, the reason for that is I've been absolutely in the thick of it trying to write this script, which is, I have to say, quite difficult to write, in the sense that when it comes to episode 6, when we reveal that Edward de Vere is Shakespeare, what we really cannot have is everyone saying, "Oh, what an arse. This man we've just been watching for 6 episodes, you must be joking. How could he be Shakespeare?" So, in other words, I've had to write the script in such a way that on the one hand, I don't put people off by making the language too complicated and too replete with these and thous, etc. But at the same time, the transition to being this very talented, rather wild courtier into being William Shakespeare is not such a bump that it's not believable. That's been one of the difficulties. Anyway, so to the final part of your question, Rosemary, about the books, the Great Oxford books. Sorry, I say books, maybe some people don't know there are books. Great Oxford, I think, if I'm correct, Kevin will correct me if I am, but I think it was published in 2005, quite a long time ago. I'm absolutely amazed by how well that collection of essays has stood the test of time. There's very little in it that needed updating, upgrading, but I've added a little preface just to say a few things about that, but it is going otherwise to be reprinted as it was, at first in a beautiful new set. And Kevin, I'm sure, can tell us a bit about one of the books that he is editing in that set. And the other one is Eddie Jolly, who's editing that one. So there'll be Great Oxford Volume 1, Great Oxford Volume 2, and Great Oxford Volume 3. They are all pretty well so ready that they're ready to go to the printers. We're going to kick it off as a very beautiful, very attractive, irresistible boxed set with all three in them newly designed by Ralph Walker-Smith. And that will be out very soon. And then for those who've got the first one and really only want the second two volumes, they will be put out as trade editions, and I think you'll be able to get them from Amazon. But I think it'd be really great if Kevin would give us a comment or two, because he was not only chairman of the De Vere Society when that project kicked off, I think, but also he's the editor of, is it Volume 2, Kevin?
Thank you, Alexander. Yes, sorry, can you all hear me? Yeah. Great Oxford One is being reprinted, as you say, virtually as it stands, and you're right, it has stood the test of time. And then a few years ago, we got together, so Eddie Jolly and Elizabeth Emily and myself, and we collected the best essays that we have found from the succeeding years, and we've put them into two more volumes. Eddie Jolly has edited the second one, and that's more of an argument as to why not the man from Stratford and what it is that makes us believe in the man from Castle Hedingham. And there are quite a few reviews in that one, so that might be a useful one to give to people who are new to it. And then the third one, which is the one that I've edited, so we're referring to it as GO3, involves a wider range of things about Edward de Vere and his life and his interests. The one about Edward de Vere's music is actually Elizabeth Emily. That's going to be in the second one. So I think they are pretty much ready to go, and they should be available in a beautiful box set. And hopefully that we'll be seeing those very soon, and with all the terrific designs that Ralph has done. So, but I'm just also thinking, Alexander, the wonderful illusion book that you've got in preparation, and I've got my two volumes here that I use, so the sort of Stratfordian ones from 1931, and I'm absolutely dying to go and just substitute your new ones and put those on my shelf there. So yes, a lot of exciting publishing problems going on. If William is still there, William Lyons, I would like to just pass over a completely different question to him to sort of anticipate Rosemary, is William, when you were involved in the Globe, at what stage did you get involved with the music? Was it very early on, or halfway through, or 5 minutes before the...
Yeah, hi. I first came in 1998, so very, very soon after the opening. In fact, the pouring rain, playing in a very muddy building site for the laying ceremony there in 1996, I think it was. So yeah, right from the very beginning. And I started playing in the... I was writing and musical director from about 2000 until 2015, when they stopped doing historical plays. I stopped working there, but also I worked as a composer on different plays. So yeah, from the beginning really, with Mark Rylance.
Thank you very much. I have a question here for Howard, and it's from Jeremy Price, and he's wondering, Howard, if you could speak a little bit to the notion of the improvisation and how that eventually contributed to what we have in the written down form now.
Yeah, I mean, the improvised commedia was an improvised form. So what I've talked about is these lazzi, and it wasn't, when you think of improvisation, it's not just, you can't just go and improvise completely every night making something new up. I think of it much more in that kind of jazz way, that there were with that scenario, you would go on and you would have keywords that would key other actors into known kind of text or known little bits of script that would have happened. There would have been very clearly choreographed music bits and dance bits, because you can't improvise those things. So I've always seen it more as there's kind of islands that you know are going to happen, and how you get between those islands, that's the bit that you improvise. And that improvisation will depend on the audience, depend on how you're feeling at that time. I suspect that probably, I mean, just from a theatrical point of view, if you're working with playwrights and you're a playwright's working up a play, you very often get up as an actor and you improvise, and the playwright will then take maybe one line or one word or one idea from that, and then they will go away and work on that. So I worked with Peter Oswald, who actually was a writer in residence at the Globe when Mark Rylance was there. And we work in that way, where we'll kind of improvise something and then Peter will go away and just write a play from that. So I think there's elements that a playwright would work with a company. It's another thing I find very interesting about De Vere, that as I understand it, he had theatre companies under him, I think, as I understand. He was sort of in charge of that, in charge of a whole kind of coterie of writers. That this way of kind of working between improvising and then writing and then giving that to the actors and then seeing what comes from that. So it can be that writing and acting a very two-way process when you're working with a writer. In terms of Commedia, it was first written down, kind of Goldoni was the first to, I think, to kind of structure Commedia as Commedia in writing. So I would think that, De Vere, when he came back, would have worked with people to improvise and get ideas and themes, and then go away and write how these wonderful bits of poetry. So they wouldn't have been improvised in that way, but they might well have come from some of these erudita poems, these poems that were looking back to Roman and Greek drama in the Renaissance. That there might well have been elements of some of the themes in that he could have picked up from the courts in Italy.
Thanks very much, Howard. I have a question here for William. Do you think that the Globe should return to the performance of the Shakespeare plays in the historical context?
Not me. Well, that's not really for me to say. I mean, obviously, it was set up with one of the sort of founding tenets that it should encourage new writing and new plays, as well as present historical versions of the original late 16th and 17th century plays, and that hasn't happened for a while. The latter, the new plays are great, and the theatre space is just as good and just as we were from the very beginning. I just think it's something of a challenge to people who see historical performance and the joy you can get from it. They see that as something as a challenge, or even a block, a hindrance to theatrical expression and interpretation. Obviously, that's not the case, and it wasn't for Mark Rylance, and it wasn't for Tim Carroll, the great director who collaborated with Mark a lot, and like Howard mentioned, obviously Peter Oswald, who I know well from the Globe and from other things, his new writing blended perfectly with the old style, the earlier theatrical pieces as well. So there was a wonderful sort of synthesis and a meeting there, and that unfortunately hasn't been embraced by recent artistic directors. So yeah, it would be lovely if it did, but I don't see it happening whilst the upper echelons aren't embracing the historical performance.
That's great. Thanks. Thanks very much, William. I have a few questions here for Derek, but he's not on the panel for Q&A. So I'm going to skip to a question which perhaps, Alexandra, you might be best placed to answer.
My apologies, Rosemary. Sorry to interrupt. Derek is, yes, he is on the Q&A. He is available.
Oh, he is on the Q&A. Okay,
one second. Please, I'm fascinated by what's being said. I don't want to speak. I want to listen and learn. I've had my moment.
I wanted to ask Derek about the globe and whether he has, well, just anything he would care to say about the globe particularly as a Shakespeare space.
Well, I've never worked there, apart from the fact that very early on when they were building the place, a group of actors were asked to go and test the acoustics. So I stood on the stage with various other actors and acted my socks off, and apparently the acoustics were wonderful. I've since, of course, visited the Globe and seen plays there. I feel often for the actors working there. I don't think it's easy to work in that space and with those audiences. I'm not sure, and I think I haven't been there lately. I think Mark was still in charge the last time I went, and I thought his contribution to the Globe was absolutely wonderful, wonderful. And I'd worked with Mark. He played Ariel to my Prospero many, many years ago. And he was a perfect choice to run that building, that theatre, absolutely. But my contact with the Globe itself has been fairly peripheral. Really, the old Vic is my stamping ground, where I was there for 7 years when it was the original National Theatre. So all my memories really are not Globe orientated, they're old Vic orientated.
They're not globular.
They're not globular, no.
The thing about the Globe is it does raise some quite interesting questions. And I know Oxfordians are constantly wrestling with and some Stratfordian scholars too, with the question of whether these Shakespeare plays were actually fundamentally written to be performed primarily at court, probably indoors in front of the courtiers, and then either in Baudelarized form or in some sort of license form are then allowed to have their performances at the Globe. And of course, in the Oxfordian story, the Globe is quite interesting because, of course, it's quite late. Oxford dies in 1603 and the Globe isn't erected until 1599, taken from the timbers of the previous, of the theatre. And so the question is, for Oxfordians at least, what is the connection between Oxford and the Globe? Well, we know that his father-in-law was the kind of boss of the Burbages, so he's all pretty close to it. But it's tantalising that we can't quite make that contact as the Stratfordian army continues rather jollily calling it Shakespeare's Globe. But there's lots, I think, still. I hope there's lots still to be discovered about this. Kevin, I think you were.
Yeah, my very first meeting of the Vere Society was in January 1998 when we were lucky enough to have the director of the Globe come along and talk to us about it. I didn't know who he was, a funny little man with a hat and with walking boots, and it turned out to be Mark Rylance. He's ever so interesting. And I think, Derek, you were there as well.
Was I?
So we went on stage. I think Richard was there as well. And one of the things that Mark said was that exactly as Howard said, that you've got these sort of main points. You want to get from A to C, but you've got slightly different routes. And he encouraged the actors to just take a little bit of responsibility and to move that way or this way in getting from one to another. And so there was a sort of a small amount of improvisation rather than sort of just doing something spontaneously stupid off the top of their heads. I just saw a note there from Annabelle saying how difficult it is to act in the Globe. And one of the things that I noticed about Mark, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, is that quite often in Shakespeare, you get the same sentiment expressed in two different ways. And what Mark seemed to do, and perhaps some of the other actors, maybe it's just my imagination, was they'd sweep off to one side saying this, and then they'd sweep off to the other side saying that. So that if you were at the side, one way or another, you'd get sentiment, even if you'd missed part of it because it was over there, or there's a helicopter hovering overhead trying to sort of catch a sort of free view of what's going on.
Yes, well, it's often difficult when you're playing in the virtual round. You must always remember that the audience is not only in front of you, they're on both sides. It's like playing at Chichester. You have to be very conscious that the audience is wrapped around you. And so that it's not only to get up there and to get down there, but to get there and there. And so you do have to pepper it around quite a lot, but at the same time, making it logical and real.
One of the other things I remember, sorry Rosemary, but just to say to William Lyons, I didn't realise how important you were in this early Globe, but how marvellous the music was. It was definitely worthwhile to arrive at 7 o'clock and to listen to the musicians and to stay there during the interval and to listen to them again, because here you had a free concert. It was absolutely fantastic. So anyway, so thanks to all. And so yes, Derek, I have seen you perform at the Globe, even if it was just a few words. And Richard.
Yeah, I have to say I was at that very thing when we were testing the Globe out, and they did come to a decision that the pillars needed to be reduced because they hid so many of the actors from so many of the audience.
That's right.
So they had to do that. And going back actually to what Alexander said about the plays being done at court and then maybe being bowdlerized and being put on stage, the complexity of some of the language is so great that if you miss some of it, you might miss something very important. So it was quite difficult for an audience to keep concentrating and listening. So Mark's idea of moving something from one way and then back, he had the ability to choose what he would say to which side of the audience or which group of the audience, because I know as an actor that when you turn upstage, your voice disappears. And certainly on the Globe stage, you had to be very careful that people didn't miss some of what you said, because you turn away from an audience and you disappear.
Thank you. Just still on the subject of performance, Hank, can I ask you a question here? If you could maybe unmute yourself. Thanks, Hank. So in the context of an actor performing where they are informed by Oxford being the author behind the name Shakespeare, how do you think that affects the actor's performance?
Well, I think that it affects it internally, and this is true of why we're seeking the authorship in the first place. Let me start my video then. My host is asking me. There we are. The great writers and the great actors, I believe, no matter what technique they use on the outside, are coming from a personal place, a personal engine, if you will, that informs the writing and informs the acting. And it's based on experience. It's based on your own character, your own person. And the more you know about Oxford, the more you know about the life that he lived in all the various ways that Alexander was talking about. You combine it all in yourself when you're looking at the various scenes that you want to play. And you internalize it. And I think that's how it helps. Because for years, I couldn't answer that question very well. What does it matter to know who wrote this play if I'm acting in it? And that's the best answer I can give. It matters personally, internally, to to marry your personal engine with what you feel about Oxford. That's the best I can come up with. I don't know if anybody else can.
Yes, I agree with you, Hank, that it really does matter. And in the script, this sort of whatever it's going to be, HBO, Netflix script that I'm writing, I've dedicated a whole episode to the performance and rehearsals of Hamlet. And what we're going to see there is something really very, very extraordinary, which, of course, Oxfordians can understand, and those who don't understand who wrote these plays can't. And just to look at, well, there are many scenes, it's so autobiographical what's going on in that play, but I think what will come across as extremely exciting is the play within the play, this whole idea that we have a play set up on the stage which has been rehearsed by Hamlet himself in order to prick the conscience of the king and of the court around. And so there you have Claudius, who fits so well the character of Leicester, Polonius, who so much mirrors Lord Burleigh, Oxford's father-in-law, Ophelia, of course, who stands very much for Anne and all that went wrong in that marriage. And the audacity of what really happened at the time, of course, is that you had a layer behind that. This becomes very Tudor and very meta, because you've now actually, in the play that I'm doing, you will have, well, Leicester may just have died, but you will have, obviously, the Queen will be in it, and Burleigh will be in it. So the embarrassment is not just the players who are embarrassing the characters, Claudius and Polonius, but they're embarrassing the characters upon whom they're based. And that's just one of a billion examples we can give of how rich it is to understand what's really going on when you understand who wrote it and what little games they're playing.
Yes, I might add that in the play of Hamlet, immediately the monarch, the king, is aware of who wrote this scene, who wrote the play, if you will, because it's almost a self-portrait of Oxford as playwright for the court to catch the conscience of the king. And in his case, often to catch the conscience of the Queen, I believe, to inform her about what's going on, to maybe prick her into action on different levels, even internationally perhaps. But the king immediately knows who wrote it, and so did the Queen. Now so did Burleigh, so did Leicester, and up to a certain point in the history here. And that made Oxford very dangerous. And that's what he's portraying in Hamlet. Immediately, Hamlet knows one thing. Now the king knows who that I know what went on, and he wants to kill me, and I better kill him first. And that leads us to the last part of the play, very dramatically. Who's going to win this battle? And it all comes about, the high point, imagine, of a playwright putting on a play for those in power, the person in power, to speak truth to power, if you will, and become dangerous because of it.
Thank you, Hank. I have a question here. It's kind of I suppose a philosophical one, suitable for speculation, but given it's from Lewis, given the invention of opera in 1639, and especially with Monteverdi, does the panel think that we would have lost Edward de Vere to opera if he had been born, say, a century later, particularly given, you know, his travelling to Italy, etc.? Would we have lost him to opera rather than being the poet and playwright that he was?
You're probably right. Music just permeates the plays of Shakespeare, and it was every on his fingertips. There are just so many allusions to instruments and to various musical terminology not to mention the word music and the word song, singing. So he would have evolved as the technology and as the stage evolved. I'm sure in today's world he would be one of the great epic directors. Who knows? Of movies. It's hard to tell. I think he would avail himself of every technique and everything that's available in the time that he lived.
William?
Oh, I was just going to say that opera, I mean, I don't think you could, I take issue with the fact someone saying that opera was invented in 1639.
Yes, me too. I think
that's not the case. I mean, there were types of musical performance going on in Italy towards the end of the 16th century, but no one suddenly woke up one morning and said, wow, yeah, I'm going to invent opera today. It's completely different and brand new. It all morphs out of court entertainments, out of ballets, out of intermedi, and out of all the different structures of court entertainment. And I certainly agree with Hank that De Vere would have been a major operator in perhaps more so in masque. I don't know what the evidence of his contribution to masques, court masques or Inns of Court masques would have been, but I imagine, because in England, the idea of what we call opera, which was this new style that was adopted, was fostered by in Mantua and in other major Italian courts. It wasn't like it was a new thing, because we had the masque here, and the masque carried on and on and on. Right into just up to the Restoration almost, and so that's the only. I'm just being a bit sort of a bit of a pedant about the opera definition. That's all.
Yes, it's an interesting fact. Kevin's going to come in a second. By the way, Kevin, you're on mute, so I'll just say this quick point that it's an interesting fact that most of the poems we have of Oxford, we know to be by him, were published in the Paradise of Dainty Devices, something I mentioned before, in 1576, and they were all described as song lyrics. So it seems that he was pretty keen to pump out poetry that would be sung and then give them to this man, Edwards, who was in charge of the Children of the Chapel, probably to be performed on stage, either in masque form or something else. Kevin?
Yeah, just on masques, I was going to say, they really came to the fore under James. James didn't really like the long plays, and he wasn't really very sort of literary type of person. And he loved the short masques, especially when he could perform. And there's a great amount of ostentation and ceremony. And Ben Jonson was the great writer of masques. And then with all the designs of Inigo Jones and so on. Where's Shakespeare in all this? If William Shakespeare of Stratford was still writing plays, he would have been commandeered to have prepared some of these masques. But we all know that the writer of the Shakespeare canon actually died early on in James's reign, so that therefore he wasn't available to do it. But one of the plays, the Tempest, I'd just like to say two things, and I'm sure that maybe Derek and others can agree or disagree if they like. First of all, they say that there's no origin for it, there's no sort of source for it. But if you look in the Commedia dell'arte, and I've written about this and it's on the website, there are three scenarii which are almost exactly the story of Prospero. And what Shakespeare has done, what Edward de Vere has done, is just to add the sort of backstory to Prospero being exiled from Milan and gaining his revenge and his restitution. And secondly, The Tempest really is a play full of masks, and it's got three of them. And some of them, to my mind, seem really a bit silly, but they're padding out what I think was originally a very short play.
There's a very interesting article in the current edition of the Oxfordian, I don't know if you've read it, which suggests that there may have been some influence with a man called Prospero Visconti, who was in Milan at the time, whose family, in Milan at the time when Oxford went to Milan, and whose family anciently held the title of Duke of Milan. And he had this absolutely enormous library, and that he was robbed, denuded of his title. So there seem to be quite interesting comparisons between Prospero Visconti and Prospero in The Tempest.
Do we have time for another question, Alexander?
Yes, so the thing is this, the concert's going to start at 7, and so what we could do is have a question, or maybe just 2 more questions, and then if people would like to go off and make themselves a cup of tea or pour themselves a glass of wine, and then get back comfortably for the concert, that might be perfect.
Great. So I have a question here for Derek again, and it's from Jeremy Price. So Derek, Jeremy wants you to speak a little bit about the connection between musical rhythm that is inherent in poetry and how that affects you as an actor in your pace, delivery, your pitch, intonation, tension resolution, etc.
Wow, that's a question. I think one, with Shakespeare, the poetry, the music is a given. It's in the words and the position of the words and the meaning behind the words. What I try and do whenever I'm playing Shakespeare is to make it accessible. It's a highly colored language. It's a language that is to some extent unfamiliar to large numbers of the audience. I remember, going as a schoolboy, a 14 or 15-year-old schoolboy being taken to the Old Vic and really not understanding very much. So much of it was over my head, words I'd never heard of. And I think for me as the actor, it is to forget about rhythm, forget about the music, go for the sense. And because the plays are so extraordinary, so extraordinarily beautifully written, go for what you're trying to say. Go for trying to express your feelings and your thoughts. And if that somehow goes against the rhythm sometimes, but makes what you're saying immediately accessible to the audience, who are not, many of whom are not familiar with Shakespeare, that for me is the way to go. And earlier when you were talking about De Vere or Shakespeare, ultimately, when you're up there doing it, it doesn't matter who wrote it. It cannot inform the way you're going to play your part. You play your part as truthfully as you can. And you're not doing it for yourself, you're doing it for, if you've got a lovely house full, 1,000 people. People are sitting up there and they're sitting down there. They've got to feel as intimately connected with what's going on as the people who are 2 feet away. And in that sense, it's fascinating, the academic adventures that we can go on, and the minds that we dig, and it's wonderful, it's fascinating. But ultimately, if I am honest, it doesn't help me. I'm not talking about every actor. It doesn't help me act the part. Learning the lines, knowing what I'm going to look like, knowing where I am on the stage, knowing exactly what I'm feeling, and all that has got to be delivered to them. They've got to feel it all. They've got to understand it all. They've got to think it all, because that's what we're doing it for. So ultimately, I know I'm sounding dreadful, but ultimately, who wrote the words doesn't inform me as an actor how to do it.
Fascinating. Thank you, Derek. Very interesting and truthful. Rosemary, did you say you had one more question, or shall we?
I do have one very interesting question, probably for yourself, Alexander. This question is from Alevi, And he wants to know, after having looked at your wonderful videos on YouTube, and also he's looked at Alan Green's book, he's wondering, is there any source material for the relationship between John Dee and the Earl of Oxford? Now, we know there are the references to the correspondences between them. We don't have those correspondences, but he's wondering, in the context of the Hermetic orders that were developing at the time, is there any evidence we can show that there is a relationship between those two figures?
So we know that in 1570, when Dee wrote his famous prelude, forward to the Billingsley translation of Euclid, that in that year, Oxford wrote letters praising Dee. And that tantalizingly is the kind of beginning and end of it. But of course it isn't. It's the end of the documentary trail, but of course it jolly well isn't, because Dee was such an important figure, very much beloved of Queen Elizabeth, and so very much in and out of the court. We know that Oxford was experimenting with all sorts of magical things, possibly with necromancy and such like, and alchemy. And he would have done that, of course, with Dee, as we know that quite a lot of the other courtiers were surrounding Dee and absolutely fascinated about what he was saying. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, some of the investigations into the Hermetic content of Shakespeare, which are really beginning to take off now, and we're beginning to see how so much of this comes out of Dee. Some, of course, comes from Bruno, who came to the court, the Italian who came to the court in the 1580s. But I think he and Dee were pretty much aligned. And what you seem to find is a pan-European group of extraordinary intellectuals who were philosophers, mathematicians, working a bit in alchemy, a bit in magic, in Dee's case with navigation. They were really all-round players who were getting themselves involved in a rather strange type of Christianity. Dee was extremely a holy, pious man, but he had differences about, for instance, the Trinity. Now, we know that Oxford spoke of the Trinity in a way that was considered most gross and discourteous to right-thinking Christians. Bruno, we know, had his head chopped off because of his view about, actually, I think he was burnt at the stake for his view about the Trinity. And some of them were called atheists. We know that Marlowe was called an atheist. We know that Thomas Tresham, who built that beautiful triangular lodge at Rushton, was called an atheist. And one wonders why they're called atheists when they're such holy men, all these. Well, I can't speak for Marlowe so much, but certainly Oxford was constantly being described as pious and holy and someone who liked to go in churches, just as Dee was. But so what were they thinking? What was going on in their heads? They had the view that the Trinity consisted of a three-part Godhead with a fourth part, which was the material world, if you like, man. So it's very slightly pantheistic belief. And that's why Dee is so sort of secretive about it. He says in his famous work, the Monas Hieroglyphica, he says the quaternary is concealed within the ternary. And no sooner as he said that, he says, "Oh God, forgive me for saying something in print that all may read, but only the worthy will understand it." And again, this comes back to what I mentioned earlier of Costa, thrice 3 is 9. Not so, sir. We know what we know. And I think once one begins to understand this theology, this way of looking things, it becomes an extremely useful key to unpicking many of the mysteries, including, of course, the dedication to the sonnets, which is set in 3 triangles with a 4th hidden triangle in the center. And it really helps us to open all this stuff out and find out so much about what's going on. And I'm very pleased that, well, to be myself a part of that run of investigation, but to find so many other post-Stratfordian scholars who are really, really looking into this and finding some incredible things as a result of it. Okay, I think possibly we've come to the end of our time in the questions and answers. If you feel that you've asked a question, it wasn't answered, and you're disappointed by that. As I said, it will continue in the members forum on the De Vere Society website at deveresociety.co.uk. Can I thank Howard, Derek, Hank, and William, and Kevin, and you, Rosemary, for very kindly doing this question and answer.